Exodus chapter 16, verses 9 through 30. Exodus chapter 16, verses 9 through 30. Please follow along with me as I read. Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, 'Come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.'" And as soon as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." In the evening quail came up and covered the camp, and in the morning dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it, each one of you, as much as he can eat. You shall each take an omer, according to the number of persons that each of you has in his tent." And the people of Israel did so. They gathered, some more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. And Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over till the morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till the morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it, each as much as he could eat. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. On the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till the morning." So they laid it aside till the morning, as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." On the 7th day, some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the 6th day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the 7th day." So the people rested on the 7th day. May the Lord add his blessing this morning to the reading of his word. You may be seated. Big question this morning that came up as I was working through preparing for this sermon is, did Israel ever exhibit faith at all? We see in this passage them falter on 2 fronts. They keep the manna longer than they were supposed to overnight. And then on the Sabbath day, when they were meant to eat what they had gathered double of the day before, they go out to look for more on the Sabbath. Their faith falters in this way. Question is did Israel ever have faith? Did they ever exhibit faith? The answer, I think, is yes. You remember Moses was very afraid that when he went to Israel, they wouldn't believe him, but then he goes, and much to his surprise, they believe him and they worship. They hear the news that God's going to rescue them, they believe it, and then they bow and worship. It's a beautiful, serene scene at the beginning of Exodus. We know that they exhibited faith further when they slaughtered the lamb and spread the blood of the Passover lamb over their doorframe. So there was faith exhibited by Israel. But then we see, like we see in this morning's text, that their faith falters. I've chosen for this morning's message the title Mayday. That title likely conjures up in your mind an image of flying, although it can be also used with ships as well. I've chosen this concept of flying being similar to faith because there's a sense in which faith, by virtue of its connection to God and His strength and His resources, enables you and I to do something that we otherwise could not do on our own. Faith, by virtue of our connection to God, by virtue of faith, we're connected to His strength, His resources, His joy, and it makes us capable to do something or refrain from doing something or respond to some unfortunate event in a way that is beyond our ability, that only glory could go to God in our doing something or not doing something or responding to something in a very healthy and good and glorifying way to God. So like a plane and its connection to the mathematical laws of aviation can lift a person off the ground to otherwise do something they couldn't do, so faith, by virtue of its connection to God, enables us to do something that we couldn't otherwise do, or respond to something in a way that we couldn't otherwise respond. But what we see in Israel and what we see in our lives is that while we might exhibit faith in one moment, we find that the next moment our faith sputters, gasps, hisses, pops, and crashes to a gnarled halt. The distress call Mayday was originated in the 1920s. It was primarily used for planes. It was originated by a senior radio officer in London's Croydon Airport named Frederick Stanley Mockford. Mockford was asked by his superiors to come up with a word that would indicate immediate distress and that would be understood by pilots as well as ground staff during an emergency. And Mockford worked at a London airport, and the majority of the flights happened from London to Paris, both French-speaking airports. And so the word that he established was Mayday, which is French for help me. I reached out to my best friend, Reed Sifford, this week. His dad, Tom Sifford, has flown professionally for 52 years, 20 years in the military flying helicopters, and 32 years flying fixed-wing aircraft in the private sector. And besides being shot down once in Vietnam and a one-time mechanical failure with his helicopter in Vietnam, he has never had any instances or even close calls in 52 years. He's an avid reader of what's called NTSB reports, which are National Transportation Safety Board reports on aircraft crashes. And what they do is they draw a picture of the chain of errors, whether mechanical or personal, which led to the crash. These reports are turned in to the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, making recommendations that they implement more regulations on flying. Tom Sifford explained that the vast majority of plane crashes are due to pilot error, numbering upwards of 80%. And even in the 20% margin of crashes, which some number lower, that are related to mechanical error, the actual crash itself is often related to how the pilot handles the mechanical error. I want to use Tom as a bit of an example this morning as we enter into considering Israel's error of faith, where they crash back to the ground from the sky, walking or flying with God, as it were. Reed went on to tell me just some of his dad's basic advice when it comes to flying aircraft. And what I found to be astonishing was that if you just did the most basic details, if you took those things incredibly seriously, you will not crash, most likely. For instance, he went on to explain that he never flies when the minimum weather regulations are not met. Even though pilots can receive pressure from the top to make those flights, and some cave, he never has. There was one instance where he was flying in the private sector, a congressman, and there was great pressure to make the flight, but the minimum regulations were not met. He knew that he probably could make the flight, but what he went on to say was, the more times that line is crossed, your chances of accident increase. So never cross that line. He could likely even face losing his job as a result of it, but he refused to do it. And when they looked back, they couldn't disagree that the protocol was not met for a safe flight. As a pilot, he went on to say that there's a checklist which includes very, very basic items that pilots can skip over. But you're supposed to go through it with your co-pilot in rigid detail. The majority of human air accidents happen during this time, and the airplane is misconfigured before takeoff. He gave an example of distractions can cause procedures to be missed, skipped, not properly taking the right parameters for weight and speed. He gave an example of in the winter when pilots make it and they're in the taxi lane and waiting to get on. Sometimes they can wait too long there and they really need to go back and circle back to get de-iced again, but there's pressure. They need to save time, or they're called to save time, money, avoid being an inconvenience to the passengers, and so they continue on without properly being de-iced. Many accidents are caused that way. He went on to explain that a lack of emergency training can also lead to crashes. When the emergency alarm goes off in the cockpit, the pilot can get so focused on making the alarm stop that he stops thinking about the most basic element of simply flying the plane, and can crash into the ground or a mountain. And in all of these things, what struck me is that what he kept to were the most basic details, sticking to the most basic details. And what I look at in Exodus is what God is doing before he gets Israel into the promised land, is he is informing them of the most basic details of their existence. If you stick to these most basic details, you won't have to worry ever. That's the deal. So he's acquainting them with the most basic details of their existence, and we shouldn't be surprised to find glimmers of Genesis in the text this morning, because Genesis is the introduction to this life. How to live this life best. And so what I want to do this morning is, just like the pilots have the checklist that they're supposed to rigorously go over, I have 3 items on our checklist this morning that surface in the text that I want us to become familiar with. If we get these 3 elements right, we will fly the flight of faith, dependence on God and His existence in a proper way, and go through life as intended from the very beginning. Checklist item number 1. You were created to walk with Him. I want you to think about this in the way that your eyes open up in the morning. That your feet are about to hit the ground out of your bed in the morning. These are the type elements, principles, thoughts that should be going through your mind first thing before the feet hit the ground. You were created to walk with Him, to live in Edenic dependence. You see, what's happening in our text this morning is God is reintroducing Israel to Eden. That's what He's doing. He's breaking out the clothes of Eden and He's putting it on Israel, and much to their surprise, they're too fat to have it fit. You ever experienced that? It's kind of been cold this spring, but I find that my shorts get smaller every year. What happened to these? How'd they shrink? This is what's happening to Israel. You see terms like evening and morning in the text. Did you notice that? Evening, morning. What does that remind you of? Genesis 1. It was evening, it was morning. We find in Numbers 11 that the way Moses describes the color of the manna is Bejulum. Where do we hear Bejulum? Well, we hear it from a stone that's listed near Eden. So it looks like this color. And what is that? What does Bejulum make you think of? Well, it makes you think of Genesis 2. And what's happening here is that with this evening and morning routine, with the color of the stone that was found near Eden, the narrator wants you to pick up on that and say, God is seeking to take Israel back to Eden. He wants them to live an Edenic experience. And what was that Edenic experience like? Well, it was like walking with God every day. That's what it was like. And so we find that replicated in the manna. How does the manna come to them? It doesn't get dropped in crates like we see in some war-torn countries where our helicopters fly in and lower crates of food that will sustain them for an extended period of time. That's not how God does it. God gives the manna each morning, and as the sun gets hot, it melts away. It's gone. Why? Because God is seeking to dissolve the barrier of secular and sacred. He's seeking to dissolve this compartmentalization of I live my life and I need God when I need Him, but then I go back to living my life. God says, no. You need me every day, all the time. You are to walk with me all the time. And I know that you'd love to get the bill of your medical report back and have it come back clean. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep it there because when I keep it there, it keeps you here with me, dependent, in a way that you otherwise wouldn't be. And so I'm going to keep the pain in your life, whether it's medical or emotional or physical, family-related, job-related, whatever it is. I'm going to keep the nag there because it keeps you here. And that's where it's best for you to be. Shared with you about my friend got out of debt and he missed being in debt because of what it did for his relationship with God. Sort of a mirror of a material and spiritual reality that he is in debt. He is reliant on God in a desperate way. God is saying to Israel, we're meant to dwell together, no separation. I'm meant to be a daily awareness in your life. And so whatever I need to do to keep that awareness there, you can count on me to do because I love you that much. That's the idea. This is the essence of daily bread. It's fascinating. We see Eden even in the sense that you remember when man is cast out of Eden, what does God say to him? He says, you will work the ground and you'll get fruit from it by the sweat of your brow. Is man getting food from the ground by the sweat of his brow in the wilderness of sin? No, he's not. Food is as plentiful there as it was on the fruit of the trees in Eden. What's God doing? He's bringing him back to the Eden environment. He's saying, try this on. And man says, this is way too tight. I don't like this. I've shared with you the story about a couple who adopted a child from a developing nation. And as they brought that child home, they noticed something strange as they fed him the first meal at the table, that as the young boy got up to leave the table, he took a scrap of bread with him from the table. They didn't know whether to intervene. They decided not to. It got a little bit more awkward when he took it to the bathtub with him. Then he took it to bed with him. And he had a regular practice of bringing food from every meal. And they understood that where he came from, when you found food, you kept a remnant of it so that you could use it when you didn't know when the next meal was coming. And you wanted to keep a portion. And they said it was a glorious, victorious breakthrough when he stopped doing that. What that demonstrated is that he trusted that their love and provision for him would continue beyond this meal. This is the lesson that God is seeking to train and re-educate Israel in. That if He is with them, He is their provision. He is enough. He will care for them. But what we find is Moses said to them, let no one leave any of it over till morning, but they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till the morning, and it bred worms and stank, which is essentially a helpful depiction of what their actions are to God's nostrils. They stink. It's not what He wants from His children, from His child. What God is doing is He's saying, look, I have storehouses, but I want you to see me as the storehouse. That's what's most essential, not the food. And what do we find in the New Testament but the very same thing? Why do people follow Jesus? He looks at them and He doesn't entrust Himself to them. He says, the only reason you're still with me is because you see me as a food depository. I just continue to mete out food as you're with me. You're missing it. You're not looking in the right way. You're not looking at me in the right way. I am the thing you want. It's me. It's not what I can do. It's me. So frequently in Israel's history, they come to God, they beg God, He answers them, and then they stop coming to God. Because they had their God. He gave them their God. He gave them their idol. They don't need God anymore. But they missed that He is God. That the idol will fail every time. He is our most basic resource. And so when the Samaritan leper returns to Christ, it's fascinating that he returns. Cognitive change takes place, that he's going and then he returns to come back. He recognizes that his most special element in his life, the best thing he has going for him, is not what he's going to, it's what he's just come from. And so he stays in His presence. And friend, the question on checklist item number 1 is, do we recognize that? Have you gotten to the place, like I believe Jacob got, that you rub your hip that God dislocated and that will haunt you the rest of your life, that will make crooked your gait the rest of your life? Do you massage that with love and joy and a deep-seated satisfaction that He loves you enough to break you, to wound you, and to keep you broken, to keep you reliant on Him? C.S. Lewis in Till We Have Faces records a young girl praying to God and begging Him to remove the pain, and she says, but now I get it. as much as I want this pain gone, you recognize that this pain keeps me on my knees with you, so you're not going to remove the pain. I understand that now, because the best place for me to be is with you. Checklist item number 2. You were created to dwell with Him, waiting for the city He'll build. So what we have here is we have Israel as an exile of Egypt at this point, an exile of the Promised Land. They're in this in-between moment. And what I've tried to point out that the New Testament authors pick up on is that you and I are just like them in this moment. We're in between two places. We're in between our captivity to sin, aka Egypt, and we haven't arrived at the Promised Land, aka heaven. We're in the wilderness period, which necessitates that it's a waiting time. It's a place it's a tent place. It's not a house place. The wilderness isn't a house place. The Promised Land is a house place. Heaven is a house place. Jesus is making for us there a dwelling place. This is not our dwelling place. But what we find when we get in this middle land here is that this part is so yet unfamiliar that our greatest temptation is to go back to what's most familiar. You ever have to swim a certain place, or you in your mind agree that you're going to swim to a certain place, and then you start realizing, you know what, this was foolish, I don't know that I could, but all of a sudden you realize you're past the halfway point. You're kind of like, it's easier just to finish now. But before that halfway point, what do? Well, you turn around. You go to the closest place, and that's what Israel is experiencing. Listen to Exodus 16, verse 3. Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt. You remember what the hand of the Lord did, don't you? It killed people. It did awful things. It did plagues in Egypt. When we sat by meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. See what they're saying? They're saying the equivalent of a Christian saying, I wish I would have never been saved. That's what they're doing. I wish I could have remained in that old life. It's what I want right now. I don't want this place of uncertainty. I want what I had, even though I know that what I had wasn't good. That's what they're doing. We would rather die old age by food than prematurely with God. That's where they're at. What we find in the New Testament is that Paul is giving the same sorts of counsel to all the Christians. He's saying in Colossians 3, don't revert back to your old ways. Don't go back there. Put on the new clothes. Don't take off the old clothes. Put on the new one. Don't put the old ones back on. 1 Corinthians 6, Paul's saying, don't revert to the old ways. Don't go back to the prostitutes. Live with your wives. Live how you should. Don't go back. He speaks in very honest terms. These are what the things in the New Testament church were struggling with. Paul's saying, don't go back to the old ways. We find that God's saying the same thing in the Old Testament. You look at Cain in Genesis 4. What does God say? He says, Cain, here is your new identity. You are a wanderer. That's your role for the rest of your life. And I'm going to be enough for you. I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to put a provision on you, a mark that no one will harm you. But you're to be a wanderer in the land of Nod, and Nod means wandering. So what do we find Cain do in Genesis 4? He built a city in the land of wandering. That's what Cain did. He didn't want the insecurity of walking with God as he viewed it. So he built a city. He names it after his son. Instead of him being in the image of God, he's all about establishing an image for his family. We find the same thing in Lot. The angels rescue Lot from Sodom, and they're taking him to a certain place, and Lot says, stop. I don't want to go to that place. Give me another city. And so they say, okay, here's your next city, Lot. What's he doing? What are they doing? What's Cain doing? What's Lot doing? They're showing that earth and captivity to earth and security on earth reigned over security with God. Give me a city I can see. That's what I want. Don't give me a God I can't see. Give me a city I can live in and feel and touch and taste. That's what I want. And friends, you'll find when pain enters your life, where your true abode is. Philip Ryken says this. Our complaint, please catch this. Our complaints really are never caused by our outward circumstances. Instead, they reveal the inward condition of our hearts. Instead, they reveal the inward condition, and I would say reliances of our hearts. Moses says to the people, he says, look, your complaint is not against us, it's against God. Don't confuse us with God. Your problem is with God. It's having the food you want when you want it, and God. This is what it is. It's earth against God. It's physical against spiritual. And what this is revealing, what this moment is revealing, that you are spiritually bankrupt and earthly fat. That's the deal. You're gaunt when it comes to the spiritual reality, and you're a glutton when it comes to earth's reality. You have a deep-seated resistance of entering God's realm, God's territory. It's too scary. I've shared with you before C.S. Lewis' book, The Great Divorce, and he figuratively pictures hell being able to go right to the borderland of heaven. And you can get on a bus in hell and take a trip, field trip, so to speak, to the outskirts of heaven. And as Lewis's character gets on the bus to see what heaven's like, he gets off the bus and he begins walking towards the borderland of heaven and immediately retracts because the grass is as sharp and pointy and painful as diamonds. Doesn't move at all when he steps on it, just pokes his feet and he recoils and steps back. And then he looks, and out of heaven is walking just a commoner of heaven. And he said the grass crushed beneath his feet like the grass of earth. Why? Because he's fit for heaven. But Israel at this point is not. They prefer earth. They're too weak for heaven's joys. They can't wait for it. They can't experience it. You might be familiar with the name Sully Sullenberger. He's the pilot of U.S. Airways Flight 1549, heroically landed the aircraft in the Hudson River off Manhattan after both images were disabled by a bird strike. In this maneuver, all 155 people aboard survived. Reed's dad commented on this, and he said that a less trained, experienced pilot would have likely tried to turn back the plane to go back to the airport, but it wouldn't have had enough to get it there, and then would have crashed in the city, killing everyone on board and everyone in the city that it hit. But as a result, he made the calculative decision to use what was left in the strength of the plane and its flight pattern to go to the Hudson River. But it's a counterintuitive decision. It's a decision that if you know your aircraft, you know what it can do and what it can't do, and you're making a thoughtful decision, even though it may seem counterintuitive. intuitive. And when Israel gets in this situation, as much as there was a frantic, as much as there was a panic, the right and proper approach to it would have been to say, stop. God just did this. So we need to rely on Him in this. That's the Sullenberger decision. It's to stay with the safest place you know, which is with God, not going back to what you think will be your security and your safety. It's with God. That's the idea. But what we find, unfortunately, is that Israel is very much like Demas in the New Testament. It's a tragic story of Demas. Paul references him and greets the believers in one of his letters from Demas and himself. So we see that Demas is with him. He's in league with Paul. He's doing what's right. But then we read this in Paul's last letter, 2 Timothy. He's writing to Timothy and he says, "Do your best to come to me soon. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica." What did Demas do? Well, he got out into the lake. It got scary. He turned around and he saw the land from which he just had come, and he returns. That's what he did. He was the seed that didn't bear fruit. That the wealth and the concerns of this present age caused him to return to the land from which he came. He went to what he knew. He preferred the joys he knew and could articulate, no matter how short-lasting, no matter how unfulfilling, versus the vast joy that he was just beginning to scratch the surface of. And friend, what we need to do daily is break through to this new world, to break through to it, to experience just the small little actions of faith. I'm not going to say this joke. I'm not going to repeat this negative story about someone, and I'm just going to see what happens. I usually say the joke. I usually tell the bad story about someone and gossip. That's my normal practice. I'm going to try not doing it this time and just see how it turns out. Taste and see that the Lord is good. I'm going to avoid going back for seconds or thirds this time. Just see how it goes. Whatever it is for us. And you'll find that even in the earth, from an earthly vantage point, the worst of circumstances, you're still satisfied. Listen to this story. 1851. Ray Ortlund writes, a group of British missionaries to Tierra del Fuego was forced to winter in the bitter cold while they waited for their supply ship to arrive. They're missionaries. They're waiting for their supply ship to arrive. It came too late. They all died of cold and starvation. The manna didn't come. On Good Friday, April 18th, Richard Williams, a surgeon and Methodist lay preacher, wrote in his journal, "Poor and weak though we are, our abode is a very Bethel to our souls." Bethel means the house of God. Our abode, our dwelling place, is a very house of God to our souls. Genesis 28, 10-19. And God, we feel and know, is here. On Wednesday, May 7th, he wrote, "Should anything prevent my ever adding to this, let all my beloved ones at home rest assured that I was happy beyond description when I wrote these lines and would not have changed situations with any man living. And he dies. Friends, God is our dwelling place above earth. Period. That's it. Checklist number 3. You were created to live in a state of rest. You were created to live in a state of rest. What we've called day 7 living. You remember from day 7, there was evening and morning the first day. There was evening and morning the second day. All through the 6th day. Gets to day 7, there is no ending formula. Day 7 never ended. It's still here today. It's as fresh now as it was on actual historical day 7 of the creation of the universe. It's fresh. It's available. It's right here, right now. God was calling Israel to remain in this rest by virtue of their connection to Him. And you know, catch how fascinating this is. You know that God still rested on this day too? What does He not do that He normally did? He doesn't give them the manna. God's not working. You ever work with a boss and he's working alongside you and you're both working hard together and then the boss takes a break? It's kind of like, oh, this is great. We get to both take a break. This is really nice. I'm usually sweating right alongside you, but now you're resting and you're inviting me to rest. And I feel comfortable resting. This is what God's doing. He takes a break with the manna. He doesn't provide it on that day. He's modeling rest. He's inviting you into His rest. Verse 29, it says, the Sabbath was given to them. It's a gift. I remember sharing the story with you with my brother Matt when he was young, and my mom was working, having them work, and she said, okay, we're going to do this and we're going to take a break. And he said, what's a break? He didn't know the term break. She said, you'll find out when we get there. And so she stopped and she gives him some Kool-Aid and cookies, and he says, hey, Mom, I like breaks. This is what God is doing. He's giving them a break. He's calling them back on Sabbath to day 7 living. This is the idea. But some, verse 27, went out to gather on day 7. Why? I think it's very much akin to Peter. Sees Jesus walking on water, sort of a flying moment, an incredible supernatural moment. He says, it's I. Peter says, if it's you, then call me out. He does. Peter gets out of the boat. He walks. He's flying, as it were, and he's walking on the water. But when he gets threatened and he hears or sees or feels the waves and the wind, he takes his eyes off Christ and immediately begins to sink. And this is what Israel did on day 7. They took their eyes off of Him, and God doesn't like that. He says to them something very similar that He says to Pharaoh. How long will you refuse to listen to me? He says the same thing to Pharaoh. In other words, Israel, when you seek to live off your own resources and your own talents and abilities and skills and mind and understanding and thoughts, when you do that, you're just like Pharaoh. You're no different than the world when you resort to your own schemes. And the result will be just like Pharaoh. I will disassemble you because you will not be my image. That's exactly what He does to Israel. Disassembles them. Puts together a new body. 12 new disciples to replace the 12 tribes. You don't look like me when you do this. You're not a reflection of me when you think you need to provide for yourself. It's not how my kids operate. My kids trust me. They rely on me. They come to me when they have a need. You notice they grumble. They don't come to God. They just grumble, and God comes to them at the first. But this time He's upset. He gives them a Sabbath. He says, you keep this day. You spend a seventh of your week thinking about me. What specifically about Him? Listen to Deuteronomy 5:15. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. What He wants them to do is He wants them to think about their greatest salvific event, namely Exodus out of Egypt. That's what He wants them to think about. And as you contemplate my bicep in Egypt, you'll rely on my bicep in the wilderness. That's the point. You are to dwell on this great act so that you count on my great actions in the next great threat. That's the idea. He wants to keep them in Exodus 14, where Moses says, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will work for you today. That is the state, that is the mantra that we are supposed to parade before our minds. Ben, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will work for you today. That's the job. That's the job. We have the promise in His Word that His grace is new every morning. We know from Jesus that each day has enough worries of its own, and John Piper takes those two passages from Matthew and Lamentations and he puts them together. And he says, if each day has enough worries of its own, and if the grace is new every morning, then that means that I have enough grace for today's worries, but I don't have enough grace for tomorrow's. That comes tomorrow. It doesn't come today. C.S. Lewis says something very similar. Listen to this. It is seldom the present and the actual that is intolerable. Let me say it again. It is seldom the present and the actual that is intolerable. You think, well, no, I really struggle. I'm struggling right now. Yes, but Lewis would say, what? About what? Listen to what he says. Remember, one is given the strength to bear what happens, but not the 101 different things that might happen. You're given the strength to bear what happens, not the 101 different things that might happen. That's the idea. This is the place that God has Israel in. Philip Yancey tells a story about a friend of his that went swimming in a lake near his house one day. And as he went out deep, and certain people do this, I'm not one that does this sort of thing. Becky does this in upstate New York, and it terrifies me. She's very comfortable with lake water that you can't see the bottom of. I'm very uncomfortable with lake water that you can't. I'm very, very much not okay with that. But she'll jump out of the boat in the middle of the lake and just swim, and it just terrifies me that she likes doing that. And apparently this guy was like that as well. And he told Philip that as he was out there, a fog rolled in unexpectedly and incredibly quick. And he began swimming to what he thought was the shore. He couldn't see anything, couldn't see feet in front of him. But as he started swimming in that direction and didn't sense the ground and didn't get to the shore, he started panicking and not sure if that was the actual direction, became totally disoriented and started swimming erratically in every direction. And then he began just taking breaks to stay afloat, not knowing what to do. And suddenly he heard a voice calling from the shore, someone that knew he was there. And followed the voice to the shore, saved his life. What we find in the Bible is that God's whispers here in Exodus 16 become the voice of Jesus in John chapter 6. Jesus is the voice calling from the shore. Jesus is the checklist. Jesus is the checklist. Giving you a checklist, but it's actually Jesus. He is our walking with God. He is our dwelling with God as He dwells with us. He is our rest. John 6, He says this, "Our fathers ate manna in the wilderness. As it is written, He gave them bread from heaven to eat." Jesus then said to them, they're saying this to Him. He says back, "Truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is He who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." They said to Him, "Sir, give us this bread always." Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst." Jesus says in John 6, this is the work of God. This is the law of God. This is the command of God, that you believe on Him who He sent. So when you wake up in the morning, before your feet hit the ground, you are to remember one primary thing, one number on your checklist, and that is Jesus did it all. Period. And move forward in the strength of Christ. But do you know how the people that heard Jesus say these words responded? Do you know which word John uses? The word that's used 7 times in just a short amount of times in Exodus 16. They grumbled. "Jesus, you're talking crazy. You can't be enough. What are you talking about? We still need our own resources. You need to provide our resources." They couldn't look at Christ. I'll tell you the story about Philip Yancey's friend in the middle of the lake. Voice calling from the shore, and he needs to listen to the voice and go to the voice, and he will be saved. One of the last things that Reed Sifford's dad said about flying, that several mistakes that pilots make, is not trusting their instruments, not listening to the voice at the shore, so to speak. Told the story of JFK Jr., you might remember, in the early 2000s. Decided to fly in the night in inclement weather. He was map trained, but not instrument trained. Which should have had an instructor with him, chose to not invite him on this trip. And flying what is believed to be upside down above the ocean, not understanding his instruments, pulled back to go higher and dove directly into the ocean, killing everyone on board. Friends, if you and I attempt life without the voice, the work, the accomplishment of Christ, we will crash. Period. If we look for our worth any other way, if we look to our accomplishments, if we look to our resources, if we look to anything other than Christ in our marriages, in our parenting, anything other than Christ, we will crash and burn. This is the inevitable result of doing anything apart from Jesus. So please, allow this morning's text to point to the bread of life, the provision of life, which is Jesus. And if you have not thrown your life upon Him, my call, the Word's call, is to do that, to enter His rest today. Whether it's for the first time to become a Christian, or whether it's to return to the shore after you've gotten lost in whatever fog you're lost in. Amen? Ask the musicians to come.